welcome you to this webinar sponsored by the Soul Repair Center. My name is Nancy Ramsay. I'm the director of the Soul Repair Center that's located at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. And I welcome you to our webinar series that is co-sponsored by Volunteers of America Shea Moral Injury Center, directed by Dr. Rita Nakashima-Brock, a senior vice president for Volunteers of America. The Soul Repair Center provides resources for religious leaders, VA and military chaplains, and civilian professional caregivers who support veterans affected by moral injury and their families. This series provides information in areas that are under-researched or for which no information is yet publicly available. Today's webinar on care for Muslim active duty and veterans in the U.S. military offers unprecedented access to information for practices of care with Muslim service persons. This webinar addresses ways Muslims in the military are vulnerable both to agential moral injury, that is, injury caused by their own actions, and receptive moral injury, that's caused by the actions of those they trusted as colleagues or as leaders. Our panelists are experienced veterans and chaplains who will share information about effective strategies for care with Muslim service persons who experience these two types of moral injury. The moderator for today's panel is Professor Amir Hussain, who is chair and professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, a prolific author regarding contemporary Muslim societies in North America. He is a longtime member of the National Advisory Board of the Center. Amir will soon introduce the panelists. Our production staff person is Sam McAllister in the Volunteers of America organization, and I will serve as moderator of the chat. In the discussion portion of the webinar, I will prioritize questions for the panelists that you post on the chat. We will include opportunities for responses to the panelists and your questions in the last 20 minutes of the webinar. And within about 10 days, the link for a recording of this webinar and any PowerPoints will be available on this site and at the Volunteers of America YouTube channel. Let me now return our attention to the moderator for this webinar, Dr. Amir Hussain.
Thank you, Dr. Ramsay. Real privilege and a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. Thank you all. As Dr. Ramsay said, my name is Amir Hussain. I teach here in Los Angeles, California. I don't want to say a lot, but just a word by way of introduction. There have been Muslims in this country at least for 500 years. You know, Estevanico, the Moor, comes in 1528 as a slave of one of the conquistadors. 1538, he's in Texas. Those of you that live in the Republic of Texas, if you go to the Capitol in Austin and look at the African historical monument, the Texas African Historical Monument, you'll see an image of Estevanico the Moor as the first African to come into Texas in 1538. So we're talking about almost 500 years of Muslims in this country. Many of you may know this book, Edward Curtis's book from 5 years ago, Muslim Americans in the Military. Centuries of service. You know, the fact that Muslims are not new to this country, Muslims have been serving in our armed forces since we've had armed forces here. And so it's my delight to introduce the people who will be speaking. In order, it'll be Chaplain Ibraheem Raheem, who's a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, an ACP certified educator. Chaplain Raheem is currently the Director of Clinical Pastoral Education at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Previously, he served as a U.S. Army nurse deployed in Korea, Iraq, and Germany. He'll go first. After him will be Shareda Hussain, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army retired after 34 years as U.S. Army active duty and reserves, including deployment in Iraq, and now is a Muslim community chaplain. Chaplain Hussain is the founding member of the Muslim Chaplains Association. And then our third person here is Chaplain Mohammed Hossain from the U.S. Army Chaplains, VA chaplain and subject matter expert in Islamic affairs. Mohammed has some issues and medical issues and won't be able to present today, but he will be available in the conversation and the Q&A. So we're going to go in that order order, starting with Ibraheem and then moving to Shareda. So Ibraheem, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, everyone. Thank you for having this opportunity for us to shed light on some of the important things that Muslims are dealing with in this context of moral injury. And thank you all, both Nancy and Amir and Sam, for setting this up and making this possible. If we can start with the slides, we'll go ahead and get going here. Let's see here. Yeah. All right. Next slide. Okay, so my plan is just to give you some basic information around the military context of moral injury and from a Muslim's perspective. This kind of spiritual challenge arises when people serve in the military and they encounter things that are difficult for them to reconcile in their faith. And so sometimes our service entails various types of atrocities and deaths, and these things weigh on people. And often they come to the chaplain, which is a blessing for us to be there for them to try to work through these issues. For Muslims, we're told in the Quran, in the 75th chapter, about the self-accusing soul. And we learn from that verse that we are created with this ability to know right from wrong, and that that trait that we have as human beings allows us to feel guilty and feel shame and feel the need for forgiveness. And from that need arises often when we can't meet that need, the moral injury can arise. And so one of the things we want to do today is kind of talk about some of the things that might cause that moral injury, and how we can reach out to people who are suffering from that. Next slide. So once we have awareness of our needs for forgiveness and restoration of our soul, we seek out this help. But in other ways, we can isolate ourselves. So one of the things hopefully we'll talk about later is how to reach out to the people who are isolated. But before we move into that, here's some examples of what I've experienced with people who ended up with moral injuries from their service. When the who, what, when, how of killing conflicts with what Muslims believe in their understanding of the laws of war. For instance, women and children, elderly, are not supposed to be killed. If that happens, often that can cause moral injury. Issues of modesty that have to be overlooked or ignored. Dietary restrictions that are either not kept or totally abandoned. And their rituals and practices that they can't do for whatever reasons because of the constraints and limitations in combat zones. So these are some of the things that I've encountered. And I'm sure there's others, but we can hopefully have some discussion around some of these. Next slide. And so really what it comes down to for me is to help soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen to reconcile these concerns. And how we go about that is to have a good understanding that often Muslims are serving with enemy forces that share the same faith with them. And this creates this dilemma for them to wonder if they've done things according to their faith in terms of how they treated the enemy forces. So that's a unique thing for Muslims often. Another thing is they may also have issues with some of the, can barely see the slide here, but let's see. If they have to, in the war, and they have to end up fighting or killing another Muslim, that can become an issue. Also, they can have some guilt and shame related to serving in the military, or serving but hiding their faith from others, having some issues with loyalty to those who they serve with versus some of those who may be in the opposing forces. And so there's suspicion around where their loyalties lie. And this also can be a problem for them. And then if we find out an instance where people are in isolation, this is a challenge also, because now they're removed from the people who can help them, and they may feel judged by other Muslims. That can cause the isolation, or they can be stigmatized by their fellow service members, which would also cause them to go into isolation. So these are some of the things that I've encountered, and most all of these have led to a need for some reconciliation for a moral injury. Okay, next slide. One of the things that we want to kind of get the word out for chaplains of all faiths is to have some information on how they can a person could access chaplaincy services or an imam in their area. Also, establishing reconnections with their local communities and the religious services. And this may also bring up conflicts between the faith and service. And so the community may not embrace them very quickly because of that. And so just some awareness of these kind of challenges with those who are in the spiritual care field can help them navigate through some of that. Coming forth with forgiveness of transgressions is very difficult for a lot of people to find a safe space to do that. And so one of the things chaplains do, one of the things I've done, is created rituals for healing. And some of those look like getting together people who were suffering with these moral injuries, and then performing some sort of healing ritual. What I've done was have them write down their transgression on a piece of paper, have a open testimony around a little circle of what happened, and as the person seeks forgiveness, they throw that piece of paper into the fire, and it burns, and then we all pray for forgiveness for the group and for each individual. And that has been a very healing practice that I've used in, both downrange in combat areas as well as back in garrison environments. Also, programs or groups designed to address the unique concerns, support groups and such. I've led a few of those, and those also work very well to give people over the period of time an ability to unpack their problems and issues and fears and seek the forgiveness that they're trying to struggle through. That's, for the most part, some of the things that I wanted to share. I'd like to turn it over to Sister Shareda.
Thank you, Ibraheem. So where do I begin? I have so many different spaces that I want to approach moral injury as I first encountered it. And it was 2014 when I received an email from Nancy asking me if I would join the Soul Repair Center as a Muslim voice. It was this new organization being created, in looking at moral injury. And the moment I heard and I understood from the definition and talking to Nancy what moral injury was, I self-diagnosed myself as having moral injury. Just to share a little bit about my background and my military experiences. So 2014, December of 2014, I retired from the US Army active duty and reserves after 34 years of service. And when 9/11 happened, that was my first day of seminary. And I went through the whole process for the 3 years of service. And then I got mobilized to Kuwait in 2004. And in those 3 years, I was very engrossed in my studies and I did my reserve weekends. However, when I got to Kuwait, my role at that time, I was functioning as a personnel officer at the CENTCOM headquarters in Kuwait. And I walked into the dining facility and we had CNN on the screen as we're in line getting to have our meals served. And that was when the CNN broke the Abu Ghraib scandal. And when that happened, I was ashamed of being in the military. I was, I'll use the word disgusted. How did we violate the Geneva Conventions? And so all of that started tumbling down on me. And our days at work were long days, and we did our duty. And then I came back to the United States. And then at that point, I was looking, I felt shame. I felt, how do I hold my head up high? Does my colleagues trust me? Will they, are they afraid of me? So all of these elements, and I was a major at the time, and I asked myself, who are helping the Muslims within the military? And I believe there's about 11 Muslim chaplains in all branches of service in the military. And sometimes a Muslim will never engage a Muslim chaplain. And so the fear is, if I speak to a non-Muslim chaplain, do I have to constantly self-censor? Will I get the support I need? So oftentimes, individuals that I've spoken to say they've never met a Muslim chaplain, they don't go to anybody, they stay, sometimes their wives, their husbands become their network of trust and who they can speak to. So when you can't share your truths, when you can't be frank with your colleagues, that's a lot of burden to carry. And as much as I'm a trained chaplain, 20 years of service when 9/11 happened, and I too was afraid. And people accuse me, sort of in a joking way, I can't share this with you. And that leaves you with, well, what are they sharing with you? And how do you feel part of the team? So when I reflect back on the prejudice, the racism, the distrust, it left me in a space of sadness, loneliness, isolation. Do I belong? Do I want to live in the United States? I'm an immigrant. Will the government take away my status and send me back to my birth country, Trinidad? Like, all these crazy conversations come in your head. However, I ended up doing a weekend workshop with Ed Tick. And he does a lot of healing for Vietnam vets, and he's written books, and he has this center in Massachusetts. And I went to this workshop, and just to be around people that appreciated me being in the circle, being an other, a different non-white person, being a Muslim. Um, uh, uh, that healing process, I started to come out of my shell. And we're talking probably about 2014, 2015, 2016. Being part of the Soul Repair Center and understanding this complex world we live in and the hurt and pain and the suffering that I'm focusing on the Muslim vets, like they believe that they should be treated equally as we are told in basic training in the military in the United States. However, the double standards are so there, so present, and the fear that they have of the Muslims. So in the military, there are about 5,000 Muslims, according to the government. However, when I spoke with lay leader imams on active duty, this one imam in Washington, D.C. area in the Air Force, he said I would always look out at the audience, and he would get a list of the Muslims on his base. And he would look out there and say, there's like 2 times more people in the congregation than the list. So Muslims, out of protecting themselves, they could blend in as an African American, white. If you're Indian or Pakistani, there's a little, there's probably a little like you will be noticed. With a name like Hussain, if you have these Muslim names, you can't really hide. So a lot of these individuals hold it inside of them, and that even builds up even more to the point that you have physical ailments from holding all of that in. Oftentimes, there's like this personality shift that one must do to stay in good grace, or to feel to encourage people that I am trustworthy. And as an officer, you would think they could trust me, but still, we're human beings and we have our stories. And when I think about, the Japanese Americans in World War II, how they were marginalized, when I think about other African Americans, how they were marginalized, when I think about Arabs, they got marginalized, and so the moral injury is rampant around the Muslim community, and not just in the military, but in the civilian sector. As an example, there's a large Somali community in Portland, Maine, in that region, that came here maybe about 20, 30 years ago. And their children are not following the religion. They're feeling isolated. They're becoming, they don't know how to cope with them. And the old customs doesn't fit into the United States. Please do stop me if I'm going over time, Nancy. So I wanted to share sort of those stories. On another note, I've been privileged to have some professors invite me to co-write articles. And this one article that we did, it was looking at Muslims in the military from World War II. We did have a World War II vet in this study, and there was this one African American man. He had a severe amount of PTSD. He did not go to combat, but the racism and the prejudices against this man, he got PTSD. And as we're talking about moral injury, you could have PTSD as well as moral injury. And so listening to this man's story, I felt, that if he could endure this, I can also endure it. And trained as a military person, we know how to suck it up, we know how to drive on, and we know how to do our jobs. But then when you're by yourself, what do? Well, I watched a lot of TV. I ate a lot of food. I gained a lot of weight. I didn't know what to do with myself other than stay secluded. Not a way to live because I'm such an extrovert, but that whole moral injury had me like, can I be trusted? Can I belong? How do I move on? And so I share these personal stories when I think also about, I'm blanking on his name right now, the gentleman that he was a clinician at Fort Hood, Nidal Hassan. That's another layer of moral injury for Muslims, because when one Muslim does something, the entire Muslim population it has to carry the brunt of what he did. And the military should have just let him go when he asked to leave the military. Sometimes we have to, I don't know how the military personnel would have known that he would have turned like that, but those events, and I just so happened to be in Texas, not in his base, but at an Air Force base, working with my command as it relates to engaging different communities in the military. And my colleagues at that point said, I knew it was a Muslim who did it. And then they realized, oh, Shareda's a Muslim. I can't say that stuff in front of her. And so I didn't fault them. I can understand the pain and the hurt when one of ours turn on each other. But it makes it even more complicated to serve, to do all the right things, to not feel like you fully belong, but the regulation and the guidelines says you do, but the human condition says, well, maybe we don't know, maybe you do, you don't. But the amazing part that kept me on my path was my faith. There's something powerful is something powerful for me to pray 5 times a day. And it's like resetting my internal conversation, praying, asking God for forgiveness, asking God for patience and peace, and help stop the wars, help us help each other. So I rely on that faith practice daily. And as I mature and I age and I'm getting closer to the grave, as we say, I'm in remembrance more. What is this life all about? It's not about gaining possessions or making a lot of money, but it's how do I live with myself and how do I live with the other? And how do we live in harmony? And how do I help you with your moral injury? And how do you help me with my moral injury or other things? And so, and I do believe, and I know moral injury, I think, has been going on since the beginning of mankind and the beginning of wars. And, the Greek tragedies, we could learn a lot about moral injury from those experiences. Wars are all the same, no matter what decade, what country. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, civilians will go through this process of moral injury. What do we call it in the next war? I don't know, but there will be yet another terminology forthcoming because man's destiny is to be in conflict with each other, with nation states and so forth. And as a Muslim practitioner, the ultimate bliss will be when we all move on to the next life and we go to heaven. then it will be the end of times. So I will end there, and I'm open to any questions. Personal is fine.
Shareda, thank you for that. There's some comments that Mohammed has in the chat, so I'm going to share those in a minute. But Shareda, I wonder if you wouldn't mind if we go back to the PowerPoint slide. There are a couple of slides there at the end. So what I'm going to ask Sam to do, which he's just done, is put those slides up again. And I think this is where we left. So I don't know if Shareda, if you want to take a minute just to walk us through. I think there's this slide, a couple more.
Thank you. I didn't have eyes on my slides, so I was ad-libbing as I go from what I could recall from my notes. So this verse in the Quran, but there is no blame on your heart, and the one is forgiving, most merciful. And that the verse most merciful, most compassionate, it's throughout the Quran. And that was one of those verses that I had to recall on myself, that I have to surrender it up to God. God is most forgiving, most merciful. And I also believe that people are most forgiving, most merciful as well at times. And maybe if we could end this war and bring all our troops home, maybe we could get to that one is forgiving, most merciful. And for Muslims, we ask people forgiveness, especially when we are going to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage. And I thought the essence of when we go there, there are rituals that we do and prayers, and then we ask God, Allah, to forgive us all of our sins and transgressions. And the one thing that a person can't do, God can't forgive a person. Let me rephrase that. So I have to ask forgiveness of the other person. Please forgive me for all the harms that I've done to you in the past. If I did any, please forgive me. And I feel like the moral injury piece, the essence of being forgiven. And maybe our government could ask for forgiveness from all of us, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And then fasting is a healing effect of the soul. Ramadan is going to be here in a month from now, and we fast for the 30 days, and it's the cleansing of the soul and the cleansing of the physical body as well. And so when I thought about moral injury and this fasting as a healing, sometimes we just have to leave that past in the past and move forward. And I've been able to do that just in being part of the Soul Repair Center, understanding the nature of people. Even though I was not able to be a chaplain in the Army, the knowledge is valuable, and I was able to use it in the civilian. And then donating one's time, money, and prayers, that we pray for each other. And giving charity is part of most religions. And time, I think, for us Americans, is so precious. So if we could give that to others, it's and we could see it as a gift and a healing. Maybe we could quiet down the moral injury and then have people assimilate back into communities, societies, even within their families. Is that the last slide? Yeah, I wanted to touch a little bit on the Muslim civilian community. And so the development of the Muslim chaplains has skyrocketed since Hartford Seminary in 2001 started, and the growth of seminaries has picked up. The most recent one is, so Hartford Seminary is the seminary I graduated from, and that seminary is in Hartford, Connecticut. And interestingly enough, that was a Christian seminary that trained ministers to go to the Middle East to convert Muslims. but they couldn't convert many Muslims. And so what they did, it was a great resource for the area. They built schools and hospitals and was a great benefit for the Muslims in the community. Bayan Claremont is in California. The Islamic Seminary of America is one of the most recent one, and they're located in Dallas, Fort Worth. Boston Islamic Seminary is in my hometown, and they've just got their certification. And the American Islamic College is in Chicago, and they're in the process of getting their certification as a seminary. And there are a few others that I'm aware of, but I didn't want to include them because they're still in their growth stage right now. And so when I look at the Muslim community, and then I look at, so the Jewish community was the community that, we're now going through what they went through coming to America. And I would say, even though Muslims have been around for 500 years, the freedom really to practice one's religion openly, I would say maybe in the 18th century, few Muslims came to the US, but post the 1965 immigration change in laws, allowing more people coming from other countries outside of Europe is when the burst of Muslims coming onto the shore. And I believe the first mosque was built in the DC area. There were mosques before that, but the first recognized by the government was in the DC area. So I just wanted to, and the Association of Muslim Chaplains, that's the organization that I feel there are a lot of young people coming into chaplaincy, and in particular hospital chaplaincy. And they're very Americanized. They understand the system, and they're able to now then take their services to the local mosque and support the communities there. So I am really enlivened about this growth of the Islamic chaplaincy programs in the United States, helping the communities. There are a lot of other cultural centers and resources, but they're not approaching the moral injury aspect. And I feel this venue, I'm hoping that, we could get this off to the Muslim community and spread the word. And I'd love for you all to also share in your different faith communities, because sometimes there aren't Muslim communities that could support Muslim veterans in particular. And some Muslims go to other faith communities for help and support, and it is well received by them, and they're appreciative. And I feel to overcome, or I don't think one can ever overcome the moral injury, but to quiet the voice in the head, it would be helpful for Muslims to also be supported by clergy and other faith communities with big hearts that want to support them.
Great. Thank you for that, Shareda. So Sam, I think we can stop at this point with the PowerPoint. Thank you for that. Thank you, Ibraheem and Shareda, for those comments. And I put in the chat for people Mohammed Hussain's comments here, which I think were quite interesting. I just want to read those for those that aren't able to get to the chat, that there are quite a few Muslim veterans who show up on a daily basis at different VA medical centers and clinics asking for diagnosis of their unknown mental struggles, but they're far from receiving the prognosis as quickly as they deserve. On the other hand, there are only a handful of Muslim chaplains who are on duty to cover the needs of this audience. That's one of the things that we were talking about in planning this, that, we're trying to think of how many Muslim chaplains we know, and we came up with maybe a dozen or so, which is a very small number. who are on duty to cover these with audits. There are not enough trained clinical Muslim chaplains, Mohammed continues to write, who are able to treat such morally injured PTSD veterans. The Quran and the Hadith talk about those who attempted suicide, who have suicide ideation attempts, withdrawn from society to harm themselves. There are only a few research attempts which show how to treat them from an Islamically holistic perspective. Mosques, imams, other Islamic institutions are still learning how to reach and treat this pocket of Muslims clinically. So that's important here. Just in terms of the numbers, we don't know how many Muslims there are in the armed forces. The last time I did work on this from DoD statistics was 2015, and there were roughly 6,000 Muslims who 6,000 members of the armed forces who self-identified as Muslim. There were 400,000 people who didn't give a religious preference. And so we think there's much, much more than the 6,000 that are there. There's been some great questions that have been put in here into the chat. If you've got questions, please pass those along. So let me throw out a couple of things. So the first one was, is there no limit to God's forgiveness according to the Quran? And then there was like a follow-up that is there an unforgivable sin? So I don't know, Ibraheem or Shareda, if you'd like to respond to that.
For the most part, there's no limit, except there's one exception, and that is if you die as a person who joins partners with God. That's the only instance where that, after you pass away and without reconciling that, then that's the one unforgivable sin in Islam. But, it's important, as I say that, it's important for people to understand that the person doesn't always believe that grace is going to be granted to them. They're believing that they did something so wrong that they can't be forgiven. Even though God extends that grace to people, this person, their own belief in their own souls, right and wrong, it has gotten them in a place where they don't believe that this is possible. So this is where the struggle is for that person. Yes, they heard that God can forgive them, but they're still questioning that themselves.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ibraheem. That's really important there. Absolutely, the classical Muslim answer is that God will forgive any sin except for the sin of associating others with God. But it's up to God. God can do whatever God wants. There's an interesting follow-up here, a question in the chat that says, in many of moral injury studies, the concept of forgiving the divine is important in the process of healing, which is a really interesting twist on this. It's not, God forgiving us, but do we forgive God for the things that have happened? And so it's a great question. Is that notion of forgiving Allah, the Arabic term for God, something similar or possible in Islam? I'd love to get your take on that. I think that's a really interesting, very powerful question.
Would you want my take or Shareda?
Either one. Both.
ladies first, and then I'll come in.
Well, I have an amazing story. When I was at basic training, so I was raised Muslim. We were Eid and Ramadan Muslims. We would fast. We would go to the 2 Eids, and that was the extent of and we knew we were Muslims. When I was 18. On Sundays, they came around saying, church call. And I says, well, I don't go to a church. I go to a mosque. So everybody went off to church. I had to peel a huge big sack of potatoes. So the next Sunday, church called. Well, I'm going to church. And they says, well, what's your denomination? And I said, Muslim. They took me to this church. And then there was this young African-American man there. And both of us looked at each other, and we knew it wasn't a prayer time, but what do you do? So I said, why don't we just recite the first chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Fatiha? And we both did. and something triggered in me. And the thought I had was, if the great military, US military, gives people time off for prayer service, then there must be something powerful about prayer. And that started my process of um, acknowledging I'm a Muslim, acknowledging the rituals and the prayers of Muslims. And wherever I traveled to, where I was stationed, I would always ask, could you find me the local mosque? So in Germany, I found Turkish people in Bremen. In Panama, I found a lot of Pakistani Indian Muslims there with a beautiful mosque. Wherever I went, even at Fort Benning, Georgia, um, uh, they had a musalla and I would pray, and the men saw me. I was the only female there. And they sort of got this little barrier and um, left me in that, and I was the only female there, but I was happy that they let me show up and be part of the. And so I, one of the many things I'm grateful for the military is instilling that in me. And then so 20 years later, wanting to be a chaplain in the army felt just right, and not to have been able to serve in that capacity was a little sad.
Thank you, Shareda. Ibraheem?
So I think this might differ from person to person, but from everything that I've seen in the Quran, as well as my own studies in other parts of Islam, is we don't have that general belief that God needs to be forgiven from us. But I don't want to dismiss that idea, because in a person's mind, that's where they are. And so I would entertain that person, especially in a healing context, and work with them with that. But the Muslim understanding of God is that He's free of sins and He can't, do anything wrong in that regard.
Thank you, Ibraheem. I appreciate that, and Shareda, your response there as well. It makes me think of taking the moderator's prerogative here. One of these statements I heard from a South African theologian who said, he would walk past the hungry children in South Africa and always lamented at God for not hearing the cries of the hungry children, till what he realized was the cries of the hungry children was God lamenting him for not doing anything about the cries of the hungry children. So there's really this interesting, kind of, does God work through us? Where do we hear this, powerful? There's some great questions here. So thank you all for that. So one that I think is a really important distinction here. So it says, the person says, I'm new to the moral injury conversation. It seems that Shareda's injury is due to having been a target of racist harm, while Ibraheem was referencing the injury of having done moral harm. And would either panelist speak to this distinction? Because I think that's really crucial, because if you are a Muslim serving in the armed forces, just looking at a snapshot of America's Muslims, at least 25 to 30% of American Muslims are African Americans. That goes back to the history. About 30% of American Muslims are Middle Eastern, but Middle Eastern could mean Arab, Turkish, Iranian. A third are South Asian, people like me from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Where I'm going with this is that, without meaning to be stereotypical, the overwhelming majority of Muslims in this country are brown or Black people. And so the racism, the discrimination, the kinds of things that are going to be faced by brown or Black people, that's one thing. The layers that are faced by Muslims who are also brown and Black people. Women who face that kind of discrimination, I'm cognizant this is Women's History Month. Women like Shareda who cover themselves with hijab. So, you're looking at, are you discriminated against because you're a person of color, because you're a woman, because you're a Muslim, because you're a hijabi? Answer all of the above, but that's a different form of, the service person who does something, and because of their doing that, that's where the injury comes from. So I don't know, Ibraheem or Shareda, you want to talk about that distinction? Maybe Ibraheem first this time.
Okay. Um, I think Nancy kind of laid the groundwork for that when she first started with the two different types of moral injury, and both happen to service members, and it's important to be able to, as caregivers, to be able to distinguish that. And I would just say that I think that's the beginning of helping someone, is to understand which one of these they're dealing with. Is it something they did or something done to them? Context that they were a part of, that they felt like they could have done something more or didn't do enough or whatever the case may be. So, but both are very common for Muslim service members to struggle with, and I think I wouldn't want to assume that something was done to someone if I was trying to help them, and actually what happened was they did something. So that's what my 2 cents on that one.
Thank you for that, Ibraheem. Shareda, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I find it interesting when I'm dressed in, when I'm with my hijab, this uniform. The animosity, the looks, the energy you feel from other people isn't a positive one. They're I don't know if they're afraid of me, they're disgusted with me, they feel Muslims attacked our country and caused harm to our country. And when I'm in my uniform, people come up and tell me, "Thank you for your service." And I'm living with that dichotomy. And I have this internal chuckle, because what do, right? You thank them and you move on. And also, being brown skin, black skin, African American, I grew up I went through high school in Boston when the racism, the desegregation was going on. And being called the N word. And I'm new to this country. What do you, I'm Indian. I'm not, the N word. And so the racism, and then um, in the military, gender also played a part. I ended up doing basic training, co-ed. It's one of the first co-ed basic training, and they stopped it. Then they went back to males and women separate. But that co-ed experience was by far the best experience in my life, to feel the equality, the inclusion, and we're all representing our government, we're serving in the military. And the part that tickled me the most, I got to bring some humor into this moral injury context. When we were firing our weapons and we were learning to fire an M16, I could not shoot my targets at the breathing. And then I finally got the techniques down. I was number third best shot in a company of 250 people. I'm like, how did that happen? Following the rules, paying attention, focusing. And I felt this equality. And I always, being raised in an Indian family, the males in the family, the brothers, the boys, they get more privileges than the girls. And I wanted equality, and I'm the oldest child in my family. I should be the mother hen.
Thank you for that, Shareda. That's great. And then I noted in the chat that Mohammed Hussain has responded to the question about forgiveness. And so there's some great information. I'd direct you to the chat about that and some of the Quranic sources there. Another question that came in, and I'm sort of dealing with them in the order they came in, which I think is a great question. What problems might moral injury pose for Muslim marriages and family relationships? I think that's really crucial. My other life, I worked with people with head injuries with behavioral problems. And when we set up our first program, we were very proud of the fact that we had a social worker who worked with our clients. Within about the first 3 days, we realized we needed a second social worker just to work with the families, because of course it's not, the injury is to the person, but of course that person exists in a web of relationships there. And so I think that question, what problems might moral injury pose for Muslim marriages and family relationships? I'm not sure who would like to take that.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Sorry about that. What problems might moral injury pose for Muslim marriages and for family relationships? I think this is one of those key issues that here you are as chaplains doing the utmost that you can to counsel, the people that you work with here. But of course, it's not just those people; it's their relationships, and then you have this person who has moral injury, who's done these things that create that environment, and how do they connect with their families? Where does that go? And so, what problems do you see there with respect to those family connections, of not just the marriage, but family relationships?
Yeah, that's an outstanding question. So what I love about this new, involvement with the subject of moral injury is it's helping me identify some of the backstory or the deeper problems that service members have that don't necessarily present themselves as moral injury. They present themselves as marital problems or violence or alcohol or drug abuse, or a person doing life-threatening behaviors. And so now that we have a lot more research and study around moral injury, we can see that, oh, wait a minute, this is tied to how the family is being perceiving and being understood as having problems with their marriage or problems with their parenting. Actually, once you dig deep enough, you find out there's a problem with a moral injury that happened, maybe even as far back as Desert Shield, Desert Storm, that never got resolved. So, yes, so I see it as once we have a better grasp on this subject, we can connect the dots and find out how it's related to family problems.
Thanks for that, Ibraheem. And there's a related question here. And Shareda, I don't know if you want to weigh in on this, but for those of us, the question asks, for those of us who are chaplains in other contexts, are there any comments on the larger society regarding American Muslims, Muslim immigrants, relationship with other faith traditions? I know, Shareda, you talked about the Chaplains Association, the training here. And I can say that as someone who teaches at Loyola Marymount University. We about 10 years ago had our first imam who came in to our MA in Pastoral Theology, because the community recognized, and he recognized, he's a wonderful imam, but that's really like a rabbi. That's really a textual scholar, someone who knows the Quran, someone who knows the Islamic traditions. What the community needed was a chaplain. And at that point, we didn't have a chaplains program. The closest we had was the MA in Pastoral Theology. And so I think, the recognition among Muslim communities of what do we need from the religious professionals, that's one thing. How do they connect? And Shareda, I don't know if you want to talk about this, because you talked about the Muslim Chaplains Association and right away the interfaith things, because, you connect with Jewish chaplains, with Buddhist chaplains, with Christian chaplains, what do we learn? And so I think those connections become really important. So, comments on the larger society regarding Muslim Americans, Muslim immigrants, relationships with other faith traditions.
Yeah, I'm very appreciative of all these seminaries that are shooting out to support Muslims to become chaplains, not only imams, but chaplains, because there's a distinction in the education training for an imam. If they were educated overseas, they're strictly focusing on the religious context. Whereas I think a seminary is also looking at the person-to-person communication and how to help individuals going through their crises. And so the one thing that I would love to see, even in Islamic seminaries overseas, as well as clinical pastoral education, is a process that every seminarian must go, it must take one unit of this training, and it's done in a hospital setting. And from day one, you go through sort of like how to navigate the hospital, and then you're visiting patients and you're talking and engaging with them. You ask them for prayer. As a Muslim, when I did that, obviously, some people even if they were Christian, they knew I was Muslim because of my head cover. They asked for prayer, and I was able to do the prayer. I remember this one woman. She was a Jamaican woman um, on her deathbed, and she told me her whole life story. And I was so, I felt, wow, I felt honored that she trusted me. And she said, I asked her, how did you know to trust me? She said, I just knew, and I knew you would understand me. So the clinical pastoral education, the whole practice of it is we as individuals in the process get to know a lot about ourselves, and we quiet down our stuff that we have going on, and we are able to be open with the other person and help them. And I think most people are appreciative of the service, because when you're in a hospital and the uncertainty is there, or when we're in a crisis, we tend to want to go back to the God-centered practices that we had as children.
Thank you for that, Shareda. That's great. There's another question here, which I think is really powerful and speaks to this reality that we've been talking about, that we have, relatively few Muslim chaplains in the armed forces. I think I was saying that, as we were planning this, we came up with like maybe 12 or so in the armed forces, compared with like, over 1,000 Christian chaplains. But this is a great question. It's for Ibraheem, with something that you described, that Shareda, you can chime in as well. And the question is, with Ibraheem describing the ritual of writing and the sin on a piece of paper and burning it, as a wonderful ritual, would it be possible or even likely that a non-Muslim chaplain would be trusted and received by a Muslim for a group or individual experience? So I think that's the broader question of, how receptive are Muslims to non-Muslim chaplains, and maybe some suggestions there for non-Muslim chaplains.
You want me to go with that one?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Because I think that ritual you described is a really powerful one.
Yeah. So, it's going to depend on the connection you have with that service member. And if they trust you in that way, I don't see why they couldn't do that with you. Especially if you're in theater in a combat zone, and this is weighing so heavily on the person that they need to resolve it, and they come to you with that based on a relationship of trust. I don't see a problem with how helping them in that way if they trust you, with that. But you can always refer them if need be to another chaplain who they feel more safe with, if they don't trust you with that ritual.
Perfect. Shareda, any thoughts there?
Well, I guess I think in structures and organizations, and one of my thoughts have been, so chaplains are assigned to a faith community by the population that self-identify. And when I think about the army, how spread out globally, or the military, I should say, how spread out globally they are, you want a Muslim chaplain in every single base, not proportional to the numbers, but proportional to serving the Muslims whatever base that they're in. I haven't gone on getting petitions and signatures to start that campaign yet, but I feel if we really want to serve Muslims in the military, or Hindus, all the smaller faith communities, there needs to be a little bit more of them across the globe. Because I know within Christianity, it's permissible, the different denomination, that people could go to different church services and still kind of get a sense of that Christian ritual in service. But for Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, we can't, or Jewish people, we can't. We have to go to our faith specific. So that would be, if I could change the government a little bit, I would say we need to have more minority chaplains and not tie it to quota of personnel.
Great. Thank you for that. And there's some interesting responses there in the chat from some of our chaplains here, which I think is really important. There's another question here that talks about moral injuries sort of more broadly, and it's sort of two parts or two questions that I think are related. Can moral injury be applied to paramilitary personnel, for example, law enforcement officers? And then the follow-up, if so, what healing approaches or methods would you recommend for Muslim law enforcement officers? I think that's a great question. You're expanding this out beyond the armed forces. So Ibraheem or Shareda, I think the answer to the first one is yes. Can moral injury be applied to paramilitary personnel, especially law enforcement? I think the answer quite clearly is yes there. But then what healing approaches or methods would you recommend for Muslim law enforcement officers?
I would say the same as the military personnel because the training is the same. You're in harm's way. I think the policemen are more in harm's way than we in the military because not all of us go on the combat field. But whereas the policemen, they never know when they're called in. And I happen to have a brother who's a Boston policeman, and his code name is Haji. Everybody calls him Haji on the force. But just his presence and his educating and bringing in the police into the mosque as well, because the effort is to normalize police in the Muslim community. And so when he got his captain's bar, at the front of the Friday prayer, the commissioner came and pinned on his rank in front of the whole community. And you would thought my brother was a celebrity. Everybody was taking photos. But that to me is the unification of the community, socializing the police force that we are your friends, not your enemy, and do good. And that's just one story in this one city. Who knows what's going on? And that may be another article to write on that relationship with the police, because the more we could normalize relationships with immigrant communities, different faith communities, I think it leads for a better community to be part of or live in.
Thank you for that, Shareda. And I can just say for myself, as someone who lives in Los Angeles, the LA County Sheriff's Department it was under Sheriff Lee Baca that they came up with specifically like a Muslim sheriff's officers sort of group, which went around to the different mosques and talked about that. I remember the first time going to the local mosque here by the university, the King Fahd Mosque, and you see like a sheriff's car parked out front, and you see, someone coming out with, LA sheriff with the gun, with the equipment. I'm thinking, oh, what happened? Did we get a death threat? Something happened. And then you see the guy come out, take off his shoes, like, oh, that's Muawiyah. He's coming to pray. And it's like, oh, okay, it's a different sort of moment there, but it's precisely that connection with the communities. There's a question here, I think that's related to that. And thank you all for your questions. Just in terms of time, we've still got a good amount of time. It's 120 here, 420, 110 here, 410 for folks on the East Coast. We got about another 20 minutes here, which is great. But connecting to this, so this is a question, and Ibraheem, you, I think, spoke about this, and so maybe you want to take the lead on this one. The question is, when a Muslim combatant returns to their community, what might be complications for them sharing that they were part of a U.S. military action in a Muslim majority country? I think that's crucial. When you talk now about the service people and you come back to your community, to your mosque, what happens when you start sharing about being in the military, especially that the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, to take just two of them?
Yeah, so that often ends in a double moral injury, because you have whatever it is that bothers you about your service, and you also have to hide it from those who you're closest to, and you can't talk about it. And so if we learn of people in this situation, that they would be the ones to reach out to, because they have no one to just talk to about these very difficult things that happen in their life and in their service. So, yeah, this is probably a bigger problem than we realize in the Muslim community. And just real quick, on the last question about police officers, my hunch is they're carrying a lot of stuff around with them. They're either a part of some bad situation or witness things that they, based on some code that they have, couldn't talk about. And so it's probably a rich field to look into to see how we could help police officers in the same regard.
Perfect. Shareda, any thoughts there?
Yeah, when I like to give examples and stories. I was on the board of directors at my mosque, and I had it was a Sunday morning, and then I had my reserve weekend, but I took a few hours off that morning to go to the meeting. And I had my military uniform on, and then I put on a jilbab over my uniform. The only way, if they saw my combat boots, they'll realize that, that doesn't look like the boots you'd wear with a jilbab, which is a long robe you put on. It's buttoned down in the front. And I had my scarf on there. And I just knew if I had walked into that mosque with my uniform on, it would not sit right with them. And so I had to, I knew my audience, and I didn't want to push the limits with them. They knew I was in the military, but I couldn't be there with uniform on yet. It wasn't welcome. And I'm appreciative to say in the mosque later on, one of the Boston police have a Muslim chaplain on their staff. So as Muslims start to become part of the communities that they live in, and they join all these different groups and organizations, the police, the fire, I think it takes a process and time. And I feel like the Jewish community is a great learning opportunities for us, like how they came into societies, and we follow in their footstep, like a great example, because they're a minority faith community in the U.S.
Thank you, Shareda. And then this is not a follow-up question, but it's a related question. So I don't know if you want to go first on this and then turn to Ibraheem. But the question is, to whom can Muslim veterans talk when they're back home in their faith communities, given that the imam may not be familiar with moral injury or very accessible for caring conversation? That typically happens in a lot of Muslim communities, where the imam is the religious specialist, the textual specialist, the person that knows the Quran, the person that knows the law, but doesn't have the chaplaincy skills. I'm not saying it's any offensive way, that they don't have the chaplain skills, they don't have the pastoral skills. So to whom can Muslim veterans talk when they're back home in their faith communities?
If they're living in a greater metropolitan area, they will have resources, because these communities are larger. They have greater donations and they're dealing with these issues. If you live in a small town, you won't. There won't be a resource to help Muslims, and oftentimes the imams they're only trained in the religious construct. They're not trained in community service or counseling or any of those things that could make a difference to the psyche of the individuals. So, but on the trajectory, there are a lot of younger people that are going into mental health fields and so forth, that are augmenting and donating their times at different massages. So I, if we were to have this conversation 20 years from now, it would be so different in the resources.
Thanks, Shareda. Ibraheem, any thoughts there?
Sure. I agree with Shareda that it's a challenge, and hopefully one of the hopes out of this webinar is to start spreading the news and getting the word out there about this challenge, and you know, pulling together the resources that will help people find people help if they're in those situations.
Thank you for that. And that's to tie into what we were saying about the composition of American Muslims. You know, Shareda picked up on this or talked about this, that, you know, the majority of American Muslims, even though we have this history that goes back literally hundreds of years, are immigrants and the children of immigrants. And so, again, without meaning to stereotype, the kinds of issues that come up around mental health in immigrant communities, you know, I can remember it was really only a dozen years ago that the first space in California, Access California Services, was set up by the Muslim community precisely to access mental health issues, because the stigma around any kind of mental health, psychiatric, you know, kinds of things there. So you're dealing with, you know, the kinds of things that you deal with. Again, I say this as someone who's an immigrant, I'm not trying to be stereotypical, but the sorts of issues that sometimes come up in immigrant communities around mental health issues. There's a question here, which I think is again, really interestingly related. Are there ritual practices in Muslim spirituality that may facilitate healing for service persons? So not just the generic kinds of rituals that we might use, but are there ritual practices specifically for Muslims that may facilitate healing? And speaking now, not as a chaplain, but as an academic, I think if you look at sort of Islamic practices, you know, we're just either starting or about to start, you know, the 8th month of the Muslim calendar, Shaban, you know, at least in Los Angeles, it's like for the Sunnis it happened yesterday, for the Shias it'll start today. It's don't get me into that kind of thing. But, you know, this leads us into the month of Ramadan. So fasting, you know, as a spiritual practice, fasting, giving to charity. Ibraheem, you talked about that. So maybe something there around ritual practices in Muslim spirituality that may facilitate healing. Ibraheem, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, and then turn it to Shareda.
Yes, there's specific references in the Quran about certain types of transgressions are addressed through fasting and making amends with the person offended. Some of that may include doing charity or doing other things that mend the harm that was done. So there's definitely fasting and other specific things outlined in the Quran for us to do once we have some specific type of transgression. But you know, I think for those to help people the most, they need to feel like they're in good standing as a Muslim and they're participating in their community as such. But what we have often with Muslim military members is a distance from that, feeling severed from that, either due to service or where they're serving, and or what they've done or they believe they've done that was so wrong. So they then get somehow separated from those practices, and then they're now kind of isolated from that help.
Thanks for that. Shareda, any thoughts there, sort of specific Muslim kinds of things that one might do?
You know, it's a lot easier if one is in a faith community where the ethnicities are the same, versus if there are a lot of different ethnicities within the communities. And for certain mosques, if you go to New York City, for example, you'll have the Bengali mosque, you'll have the Serbian mosque, you'll have the Pakistani mosque, and so if you are in those circles, it depends on the culture, the mores of the culture. Do you bring your problem to another person or the imam to help solve? Do you bring your deepest, darkest, horrible thing that you've done? I don't feel that the Muslims are there yet in really reaching out for that type of support. because of I think because we're still in this early immigrant stage, and whatever that was done in the countries they came from, those mores stay stay hold, and they don't have the trusted elders yet that they could go speak to. And sometimes the imam is the only person there, or maybe volunteers. And there's a sense of shame, even though they need that support. I feel like there's a sense of shame. And when I supported the imam in Boston as a Friday after the masjid or before for spiritual care, this is what this one young girl told me. I can't tell the imam this, but it was okay to tell me. So I don't know if it was me as a female that they could talk to. So then I think also gender has a part to play, that you need women in the mosque so women can go to and talk and feel comfortable and not have the, and then also need men, not just the imam, because, and to have the training and understanding the nature of people, understanding the Quranic text. So I feel I'm hopeful that it will happen because of these different centers that have opened up, but they're starting to come into the mosques as well.
Thank you for that. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we'll turn it over in about 5 minutes to Nancy to wrap us up. But a couple more questions here. What does your experience in active duty suggest for educating non-Muslim leaders and chaplains to create a more welcoming faith posture? So, for example, lowering more receptive moral injury that arises from suspicion. So, what do you suggest for educating non-Muslim leaders and chaplains to create a more welcoming faith posture? I don't know, Ibraheem, if you want
to. Okay. Watch this webinar, maybe. Well, reach out to. We have 6 Muslim chaplains on active duty in the Army, and at least 7 or 8 in the other services. So, reach out to us, sit down, and kind of bring questions and have dialogue about things ways that you can help your people. I think that's the best way forward.
I would also add, and I want to ask Ibraheem a question. Do the Muslim chaplains use their lay leaders as the next in line from when their bases don't have Muslim chaplain? Do you guys have the dialogue and the conference meetings and so forth?
Yeah, in the ideal circumstance, a lay leader can be trained and can establish rapport with the chaplains in their base, and it could really be nice. But they are limited in what their training and what they can really share, especially around moral injury. But but guys are limited in terms of the future and getting the information out, getting around to the various communities and having discussions, maybe not formal discussions like this, but just informal discussions about the subject and how we can help service members who are in need of the care, but don't always feel that there's someone that they can talk to. So.
Thank you for that. And I think we have time for one more question before I turn it over to Nancy and thank everyone here again. And this is how well does the VA do in providing mental health providers familiar with predictable complications that Muslim veterans and active duty combatants encounter? My guess is the answer is no disrespect to the VA, is not very well. I mean, if we look at just education about Islam and Muslims, I've been privileged every couple of semesters to go to the Naval Academy, and I teach. Brennan Wheeler teaches at the Academy in history, and he has me come and talk with the people there about Islam. Just as that basic information. So just even, I don't know that we do a good enough job giving people basic information about Islam and Muslims, let alone the kind of mental health training that is needed. So that's the question, how well does the VA do in providing mental health providers familiar with predictable complications of Muslim veterans and active duty combatants encounter?
Well, that's a great question. And I am not aware of a Muslim in that capacity. I know Mohammed probably being at a vet center, and Abdul Rashid Mohammed also is in San Diego Vet Center. That if you lived in those areas and you're Muslim, you'll probably get these two individuals. But I'm not aware of that resource, and I'd love to if Brother Mohammed could say something on that.
Yes, I'm feeling a little better now. I can, but to answer that question is really targeted to VA Muslim veterans. We are only two full-time Muslim chaplains, one sitting in California and I'm sitting in DC. And we have about 1,000 plus chaplains in 151 VA medical centers and clinics. We get bombarded by call, telephones from chaplains from different setups to solve the Muslim veterans issues. So this is an alarming situation that only two VA Muslim chaplains full-time. I think we have some contacted Muslim VA chaplains here and there, not more than half a dozen. Versus we have lots of Muslim veterans, inpatients and outpatients that come, and they try to get direct Islamic services, which is not enough to serve through these only two full-time Muslim chaplains and part-time chaplains, excuse me. So this is a great question, and we do have Muslim veterans come in ETS from the active side and try to land on a veteran side, try to reach out the Muslim veterans to get their services, which is not enough. Especially when we are talking about moral injury, we have lots of Muslim veterans through their talks, through their activities, through their acts. We can tell they want to say something about their what they have experienced in the military. They come with broken families, broken heart, but there's not enough help. I am not asking that I'm an expert, but through the experiences meeting them, I can call that I have a lot of experience in meeting them, but we need more Muslim chaplains in the system and trained Muslim chaplains to solve their mental disorders. Hopefully I could talk a little bit more. I'm sorry, I could not talk. I've been suffering with my health issues for about a month. So this is a great program that I wanted to be a part of it. And to reach this program, actually, I left my mother in Bangladesh just to get here. But God's idea, God's decision that I could not be talking a lot. I was preparing to talk. I'm sorry about it. Let me stop there. Excuse me.
Thank you for that, Mohammed. And comes at an opportune time to be able to thank you and everyone else. I'm going to turn over to Nancy in a second, but I do want to thank a couple of people literally behind the scenes, Sam McAllister, who makes all of this possible, and Rita Brock from Volunteers of America. But thank you to Chaplain Mohammed Hussain, to Ibraheem Raheem, and Shareda Hussain for doing this. Nancy, any final thoughts from you?
Well, Amir, also thank you to you. I think the last parts of this discussion underscoring how woefully understaffed we are in terms of providing chaplaincy services is an important point for us to take away. And I appreciated one of the notes from a participant that it's also incumbent on chaplains, particularly the majority being Christian, to be much more actively involved in educating themselves, to be at least better attentive to this need. But I'm grateful that we could at least today begin to lift up these particular dimensions of the experience of moral injury and vulnerability to it that arise for Muslim active duty and veterans. And hopefully this will spur more intentionality for providing better resources, both during active duty on bases and also in the VA. And I certainly want us to express our appreciation to Amir and Ibraheem and Shareda and Mohammed, who sadly, after that trip back here, had this cough that has been preventive. And I'm very grateful to Ibraheem and Amir and Shareda for continuing to serve on the National Advisory Board for the Center. And we hope that the Center can continue to be a resource for others in providing information, particularly about caring for veterans and service persons who are Muslim, who identify as Muslim and are affected by moral injury, and their families, because of course, moral injury, when it comes home, it happens in families. It's something that is not just held privately. So thank you all for watching, and remember that within about 10 days on the site of the Soul Repair Center and at the YouTube channel at VOA, the link for this webinar and the PowerPoint will be available to you. We're grateful you could spend this time with us, and thank you participants once more.